Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we finish Jeremiah with Jeremiah chapter 52. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of Yahweh it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came with all his army against Jerusalem, and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled and went out from the city by night, by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden, and the Chaldeans were around the city. And they went in the direction of the Arabah, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king, and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he passed sentence on them. The king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and also slaughtered all the officials of Judah at Riblah. He put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains, and the king of Babylon took him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death. In the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard who served the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem. And he burned the house of Yahweh, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, every great house he burned down. And all the army of the Chaldeans, who were with the captain of the guard, broke down all the walls around Jerusalem. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive some of the poorest of the people, and the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the artisans. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. And the pillars of bronze that were in the house of Yahweh, and the stands, and all the bronze that were in the house of Yahweh, the Chaldeans broke in pieces, and carried all the bronze to Babylon. And they took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the basins and the dishes for incense, and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple service. Also the small bowls and the fire pans and the basins and the pots and the lampstands, and the dishes for incense and the bowls for drink offerings. What was of gold, the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was of silver, as silver. As for the 2 pillars, the 1 sea, the 12 bronze bulls that were under the sea, and the stands which Solomon the king had made for the house of Yahweh, the bronze of all these things was beyond weight. As for the pillars, the height of the 1 pillar was 18 cubits. Its circumference was 12 cubits, and its thickness was 4 fingers, and it was hollow. On it was a capital of bronze. The height of the 1 capital was 5 cubits. A network and pomegranates, all of bronze, were around the capital, and the 2nd pillar had the same, with pomegranates. There were 96 pomegranates on the sides. All the pomegranates were 100 upon the network all around. And the captain of the guard took Seraiah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the 2nd priest, and the 3 keepers of the threshold. And from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the men of war, and 7 men of the king's council who were found in the city. And the secretary of the commander of the army, who mustered the people of the land, and the 60 men of the people of the land who were found in the midst of the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. This is the number of the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive. In the 7th year, 3,023 Judeans. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the Judeans 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs, until the day of his death, as long as he lived. This is the word of the Lord. Now I'm going to go ahead and just prefix this chapter. If you have read 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25 recently, you've read almost all of this chapter. It's almost identical. In fact, so a little bit more specifically, 2 Kings chapter 24, starting at verse 18, all the way through 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 21, is parallel to this chapter, chapter 52, verse 1 through verse 27. Yeah, 27. Then you do have a gap. So verses 28 to 30 of Jeremiah here are unique, whereas verse 31 through 34, again, parallel 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. So where we get this unique section, just a few verses about how many people Nebuchadnezzar had carried away, in the book of 2 Kings chapter 25, in that same place, instead of these numbers, we have an account about Gedaliah being made governor over Judah by Nebuchadnezzar. Why that's not included here may have something to do with the fact that Jeremiah has already told us about Gedaliah being made governor, and he's already told us that Gedaliah was killed as that first governor over Judah as well. Hard to say for sure. Outside of that difference, though, primarily they are identical texts. In fact, they are identical from Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 1, all the way through, halfway through verse 7. A breach was made in the city, all the men of war fled. Up through that phrase, everything is a word-for-word match to that 2 Kings text. After that, there are differences, slight differences in wording and so forth, but it's all, you could follow along without trouble, certainly. It's so close. And this connects very well with the idea from Jewish history and tradition that Jeremiah the prophet is the one who wrote 1st and 2nd Kings. And in the Hebrew Bible, it's only one book. It's just the book of Kings. Today, as you look at the Lutheran Study Bible, it usually tells you who wrote a book. It will tell you that the author of the book of Kings is unknown. And in fairness, the author of the book of Kings is not known. Unlike the book of Jeremiah, where we're told about Jeremiah here, or you get an epistle in the New Testament and Paul introduces himself at the beginning of it. No such thing happens with the book of Kings, but the parallel of these two chapters certainly makes sense that Jeremiah is the author, that the Jewish tradition on that is correct. Another note that I've picked up before as we've talked through our book here together was that Jeremiah uses the name of a place in the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. He calls it Topheth, Topheth. He uses it several times, and outside of the book of Jeremiah, it only appears in the Old Testament one other time, and that's in the book of Kings. And so there's connections like that, little things that make that seem to be a very fitting, it's at least an educated guess, but could very well be true. Now, as we look at the chapter and what's actually in this text, Zedekiah is 21 years old when he becomes king. That's 597 BC. He reigned 11 years. We learn his mother's name, daughter of Jeremiah. That's not the same Jeremiah that is the prophet here. He did evil in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. That's one of his brothers, one of the other sons of Josiah. And these first two verses are very much similar to the formula that you see in the book of Kings. As you would go through that book, you would see after each king, or at the beginning of each king's reign, such a formula depicted, telling you when they reigned, how long they reigned, and so forth, and if they were good or evil in the eyes of Yahweh. In fact, just as a numbers thing for you, of the northern kingdom of Israel, which is already defeated at this point, they never had a good king. Every one of them was described as doing evil in the sight of Yahweh. I can't say that. There were 19 of them after the divide of the kingdom. 18 of them are described as evil in the sight of Yahweh. The other guy only reigned for a month, and he simply doesn't have a description as being evil or good, but he took the throne by assassination. So probably not good. Judah, the southern kingdom, is a little different. The same number of kings, actually. They both end up at 19. Judah has 8 who are considered faithful in the eyes of Yahweh, the last being Josiah, father of Zedekiah and Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim. But 11 bad kings who did evil in the sight of Yahweh, with Zedekiah and both of his brothers being on that list. Because of this, God drives them out. He drives them out from his presence. That would be a reference to the temple, and I believe this is going to be the first time in the book that we have seen talk of the destruction of the temple, that was not recorded previously. Zedekiah rebels against the king of Babylon, verse 3. Zedekiah was a puppet king. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, set him up. Nebuchadnezzar gave him the throne. You can imagine the deal there, as long as you obey me, kind of a thing. And Zedekiah has rebelled against that, and thus Nebuchadnezzar has come to make war against him. And so that's going to bring us to verse 4, and we've already had verses 4 through 11 in the book of Jeremiah itself. Essentially, chapter 39, verses 1 through 10 also included a very similar section, a little bit of differences. But the 9th year of the reign of Zedekiah, which would be 589 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem, besieges it, and that siege lasts for a year and a half until 587 BC, and on the 4th month, there not only is the famine bad, but a breach is finally made in the wall of the city, and the Chaldeans are able to overcome it. They destroy it. The note that we have before that, though, is that the men of war, so the ones who should have been, fighting against the Chaldeans when the Chaldeans came into the city, instead they fled. They used one of the gates of the city, and they tried to sneak out. They tried to sneak past the Chaldean army, but the Chaldeans chased them down. They were going in the direction of the Arabah, which is a little confusing here. The Arabah usually is a reference to the area, that kind of a dry land south of the Salt Sea, but the Salt Sea is also sometimes referred to as the Sea of Arabah, and so this then is a reference not just to the land south of it, but also the stretch of land that runs north of it along the Jordan River as well. And that's the context that makes sense of this then, because the Chaldeans overtake Zedekiah and these men in the plains of Jericho, which are going to be just to the west of the Jordan River, north of the Salt Sea. And so they not only capture them, they then take them to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, at Riblah. Riblah is probably a couple hundred miles north. It's 100 miles north even of the city of Damascus, which is in Syria. And there Nebuchadnezzar will pass sentence. He kills the sons of Zedekiah, so that cuts off the family line. No more heirs to the throne. And then he kills the officials of the king as well. He then blinds Zedekiah and takes him off to Babylon, where he imprisons him until the day of his death. We're not told how long that takes. We don't know how long Zedekiah lived. At least 32 years, but certainly could have been many more. At this point, there is no longer a king on the throne over God's southern kingdom of Judah, nor the northern kingdom of Israel either. Hasn't been for many years at this point. So a question maybe for your children. God's people don't have a king anymore. Who is their next king? Now, you could try to do the history thing and say Nebuchadnezzar. And then after Nebuchadnezzar, we get the name Evil Merodach later on in the chapter, and there will be other kings over Babylon, and then the kings of Persia, and then the kings of Greece, and then the kings of Rome. You could do that if you wanted to. But they're not considered a nation at any of those points. And so they're just a province, would be one word for it, as they are just part of a larger empire, the next true king to sit over the throne of Jerusalem again. God's promise that one of David's descendants would always sit on his throne forever. That king is Jesus. He is the one that we look to. All right, so again, more familiar detail here with the temple burning from 2 Kings chapter 25. And this is going to happen in the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, which puts us at the 587 point, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He's going to destroy the temple. Nebuzaradan, the captain of his guard, burns down the house of Yahweh, and also the king's palace, all the homes in Jerusalem, really great or small. Solomon built that temple in 961. Well, finished it in 961, and he finished the palace in 948 BC. So these buildings had stood for almost 400 years. And they were both exquisite. They were both very costly buildings. You can read about them in roughly 1 Kings chapters 6, 7, and 8, where you see those things happening, that section. But Nebuzaradan destroys them. He takes the people into exile. He does leave some of the poorest of the land to work the land. Basically, they're servants of the king of Babylon, so they'll get to keep what they need to eat for themselves, but the excess will go to Babylon to make Babylon greater and feed its armies and so forth. Verses 17 through 23 are going to give us some description of what the Chaldeans do to the temple. And not only do they tear it down, they take some of it, they break into pieces to carry it away. We don't have that, and that's mostly bronze things. We don't have that note about what's made of gold or silver, however. Those things are just spoken of as being taken away. The weight, even of the bronze, the weight was beyond weight. There was too much there for them to even measure it. This is the plundering, right, of the Chaldeans plundering Jerusalem. This is them trying to get stuff, but a lot of it ends up going to Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, the utensils and such that were used in Yahweh's temple get taken to the temple of Nebuchadnezzar's false god, which is probably Bel or Marduk, and they're used in worship of him instead, until the end of Babylon, when Belshazzar brings those utensils out from the house and uses them to entertain the guests at his party, to which God and then Daniel bring that judgment in Daniel chapter 5, which is the end of Babylon. That very night they fall to the Persian king Cyrus, who in that chapter I believe is referred to as Darius the Mede, but Cyrus is the same man. All right, so as we look then at, let's see, verse 24, again, more of this text that's repeated from 2 Kings. The captain of the guard is going to take Seraiah, Zephaniah, keepers of the threshold. So he takes the important men of the temple and the priesthood. He takes the man who commanded the soldiers. He takes the man who mustered the soldiers together and gathered them. He takes people from the king's council. He takes 60 other important men that were found in the city. He brings them all to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. Not really any different than Zedekiah having been brought to Nebuchadnezzar, and the same result, that they are struck down. Nebuchadnezzar kills not only the king's sons and cuts off the heirs of the throne, he kills all the men of importance in Jerusalem. The rest are exiled, taken to Babylon. That gives us our unique section. Verses 28 to 30 are going to give us information here. Again, Gedaliah becoming governor is the 2 Kings 25 substitution. Here, though, we learn who Nebuchadnezzar takes captive, numbers-wise. And so in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, which would ultimately be the 597 BC time where Nebuchadnezzar had come against Jerusalem, he captured her king, Jehoiakim, took him into prison, and that's when he put Zedekiah in charge. So there he takes 3,023 Judeans custody. 2 Kings 24 verse 14 had said he took 10,000 captives. So that would make it sound as though the majority of those captives mentioned in 2 Kings weren't originally Judean. So other people from other lands, like the Rechabites perhaps, they were mentioned earlier in Jeremiah here, just dwelled in Jerusalem for safety because Nebuchadnezzar had devastated so much of the region around them. Then in the 18th year, which is now 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar has carried away 832 people of the Judeans. And in the 23rd year, which is going to be 583, 582, that Nebuzaradan will carry away the rest, 745 persons, which is an interesting mark, meaning that the besieging happens, but they don't carry everyone away right away, is the picture basically. And there aren't a lot of people left. They took more than half of them, and that's if you don't count the ones that they executed at Riblah, so most of the people. Now, this is a thing to talk about as a family. Jeremiah in chapter 29, Jeremiah sent a letter to the exiles in Babylon telling them to keep living, that they should build, they should marry, they should increase in number, because the Lord was going to rescue them. 4,600 people were taken captive to Babylon. Did they keep that word of God faithfully? Did they marry and have children? And the answer to that is yes. So ask your kids if they think they did, and then take them to Ezra chapter 2, and you learn there that 42,360 people returned from exile to Judah in 538. So over the span of 2 or 3 generations, they multiply, and they go from 4,600 to 42,000. Got to point out the moments of faithfulness in the Old Testament because they're just not that common among sinners. None of this happens had God's people kept his word. The text then ends with Jehoiakim in the 37th year of the exile, that would be his exile from 597 until 561, being set free. Not free to go home, but to enjoy life at the king of Babylon's table. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer king. He has passed away, and his son, Evil Merodach is the name used in Scripture. Amel Marduk is the historic name outside of Scripture that's usually used. 562 to 560 was his reign. He's murdered by his own brother-in-law, so his sister's husband, and that man takes the throne from him in 560. Anyway, he freed Jehoiakim. He allows him to eat at his table for the rest of his days. We're not told how long that lasts either. Just as we don't know how long Zedekiah lived, we do not know how long Jehoiakim lived. So the last couple of kings of Judah, exiled into Babylon, but the promise stands, and there is a little bit of faithfulness. The people will be restored, and a king will be over Judah again, the king that we know as Jesus.